Hello everyone, I am Saurav and I welcome you back to the Digital Board series by Orchids Biosciences. This is the second chapter of the series, that is Control and Coordination. In the previous videos, we have discussed the first chapter of the series, that is Life Processes. If you haven't watched Life Processes yet, for you I have provided its link in the description below, so please go and watch it. Now, let us begin with the next chapter of the series, that is Control and Coordination. In this video, we will learn about the following topics. First, we will start with what is control and coordination. Then the systems in our body which controls and coordinates, they are the nervous system and the hormonal system. In this video, we will discuss about nervous system, in which we will study about its structural and functional unit, that is neurons, and then we will discuss about the reflex action. So let's start with control and coordination. So what is control and coordination? We know that all the organs of our body work together to keep us alive. They work together as a team. They do not work independent of each other. Let us consider the example of ingestion. Ingestion is the taking in of food. So during the process of ingestion, what happens is the food is present and the eyes are necessary to locate the food. The nose is important to register the smell, and with the hands we pick up this food and we put it into our mouth. So we can see just in such a small process of ingestion, there are so many organs involved, and all these organs are coordinating with each other so that we can take in the food through our mouth. So for such a small process, there are various organs involved, and these organs coordinate with each other to work to perform the task. If they start working independent of each other, the task cannot be completed. So we can see every organ is coordinating with each other to perform the task of ingestion. Coordination is not only in terms of eyes, nose and hands. There are various other coordination happening in our body. For example, in the process of digestion, all the organs of the digestive system has to coordinate with each other to complete the process of digestion. So all the life processes also have to be coordinating with each other to keep us alive. So not only coordination, every part, every organ has to also be controlled. For example, when we eat food, our stomach produces the HCl acid, we know. So there should be a coordination between the intake of food, that is through the mouth, and the production of HCl. But there should also be a control over the production of HCl, that is, it should be proportionate to the amount of food that we eat. And here comes the need of a control system. So our body needs a system which controls the organs and as well as coordinates between different organs to keep us alive. So in our body, there are two systems which does the process of control and coordination. They are, first one is nervous system and the second one is hormonal system. The nervous system is seen only in case of human beings. It is not there in plants. But whereas in plants, the hormonal system is present. So hormonal system is present in both human beings and plants. Now let us first discuss about the nervous system. Whenever we touch something hot, a hot pan or a hot dish, we immediately recognize it as hot. How do we recognize it? We have certain cells in our body which recognize it and sense this information, and in return we respond to it and remove our hands. So these cells are called as neurons, and neurons are the basic structural and functional unit of our nervous system. So let us study about these neurons. First, let us look at the structure of the neuron. Neuron has a very simple structure. It has a cell body which is called the cyton or cell body. Then there are some branchings in this cell body which are called as dendrites. The cell body has a large and prominent nucleus and continues into a long part which is called as a axon. Then finally this axon branches into many branching called as a axon terminal. So we can see it basically has three major parts: one major cell body or the cyton, then a long process called as axon, and finally the axon branches into the axon terminals. Then how does this neuron receive the signal or receive the information? These dendrites present in the neurons will receive the information. For example, whenever we are touching something hot, in our fingertips there will be this neurons which will be having the dendrites. So these dendrites will be receiving this information that there is something hot and will pass through this neuron. So the dendrites will receive the information, then the information will come to the cell body, then it will pass through the axon and it ends into the axon terminals. So if we see the passage of the information, it is from the dendrites, then it goes on to the cyton or cell body, then it goes into the axon, and finally to the axon terminals. So this is how the information is passed. But how is the information passed? In what form is information passed? The information is passed in the form of electrical impulses. So in the form of electrical impulses, this information that the substance is hot is transferred from one neuron to another neuron. So how are these neurons connected? They are connected, but there is always a gap in between two neurons, and this gap in between two neurons is called as a synapse or synapse. So there are various neurons which will receive this information. There are some neurons which will receive the information of taste. There will be some neurons which will receive the information of smell. Some neurons will receive the information whether it is hot or cold. So there are various neurons in our body to receive the information, and these are called as the receptor neurons because they receive the information from the surroundings. For example, we can take few examples like the gustatory receptors, which give us the information of taste. And how do we taste the food? Through our tongue. So the gustatory receptors are present in our tongue. Another example can be olfactory receptors. The olfactory receptors help us to sense the smell, and we smell through our nose. So the olfactory receptors are present in our nose. So different organs are responsible for sensing different substances. For example, tongue is responsible for sensing the taste of the food, whereas a nose is responsible for smelling the food or to identify the smell of the food. So these receptors are nothing but the neurons which will receive the information from surroundings. It can be taste, smell, touch, or any other information. So that is all about receptors. So now how are these receptors receiving the information and passing it to the next neuron? We have seen that there is a space present in between two neurons called as a synapse. So how is the information passed from one neuron to another neuron? We know basically that in form of electrical impulse, it travels inside a neuron. But what happens outside the neuron or in between the neurons? We know that in between the neurons, there is a space that is called as synapse. This is the previous neurons, axon terminal. Whereas below the synapse, we can see the next neurons, dendrites. So there is a space in between that is synapse. So how is the information traveling in between this space? In the synapse, the information is passed in the form of chemicals, and the chemical neurotransmitters are responsible for transmitting it in between the neurons. So what happens is the information which is coming in the form of electrical impulse is now transferred in the form of chemicals to the next neuron, and then it continues in the next neuron in the form of electrical impulse back again. Inside the neuron, it is traveling in the form of electrical impulses. Whereas in between the neurons, that is in the synapse, the space present in between the neurons, this electrical impulse is traveling in the form of chemicals. This is how the neurons transmit the information from one neuron to the next one. Now, let us look into the types of neurons. Neurons are basically of three types. They are the sensory neurons, the motor neurons, and the third one is relay neurons. Now, what are the function of these neurons and how are their functions different from each other? Let us take an example. What happens when we touch something hot? So, when we touch something hot, there are some neurons which will send this information to our spinal cord and brain. So to sense this information and send to spinal cord and brain, there are certain neurons involved. So they are called as the sensory neurons. So sensory neurons transmit the information to the spinal cord and brain. Now this information has to be processed and our hands have to be lifted. So the neurons which are responsible for carrying this information back to our hands so that we can take our hands back are called as the motor neurons. So the motor neurons carries the information from the spinal cord and brain. Then what about the neurons which are present in the spinal cord and brain? They are called as the relay neurons. So relay neurons are present in between the sensory and the motor neurons. So relay neurons are present in the brain and spinal cord, that is in between the sensory and motor neurons. So these are the three neurons: sensory, which receives the information; motor, which brings back the information; and relay, which is transferring the information in between the sensory and motor neurons. So these are the three types of neurons in our body. Now we have seen about the neurons. Let us see how they work when we touch something hot and we need to quickly respond to it. When we need to respond very quickly or immediately to any change in the environment, the information is processed and the spinal cord itself sends the information to the motor neurons and we remove our hands. The spinal cord will send the information to brain definitely, but will not wait for the brain to respond to it, whereas the spinal cord itself will send the information to the motor neurons so that we can take our hands away. Let us see how this happens. So when we touch something hot, there are sensory neurons present in our fingertips. So through the sensory neurons, the information is sent to the spinal cord. Then in the spinal cord, there are relay neurons. This relay neurons will transfer the information from the sensory neurons to the motor neurons, and this motor neurons will carry the information from the spinal cord to our fingertips back again. And these motor neurons are associated with our muscle cells. So the sensory neurons receive the information and send to the spinal cord. The relay neurons will transfer the information from the sensory neuron to the motor neuron, which is associated with our muscle cells, so that we can pull our hands back. The spontaneous action performed by the spinal cord along with all these neurons is called as the reflex action. This is a very fast and spontaneous action. In this, the information is sent to the brain but does not wait for the brain to respond to it. And this pathway traveled during this reflex action is called as reflex arc. So reflex arc is a pathway which is traveled during the reflex action. So if we try to trace the path, it is sensory neuron, from the sensory neuron to the relay neurons, which is present in the spinal cord, and the information is given back to the motor neurons. This is the pathway of the reflex action. Now let us quickly recall what we have discussed so far. We started with what is control and coordination and why it is important for us to survive. Then we discussed about the systems which are responsible for controlling and coordinating. They are the nervous system and the hormonal system. In this video, we discussed about the nervous system. Then in nervous system, we discussed about the structural and functional unit, that is neurons. Then we discussed about the structure of neuron. Neuron is made up of three major parts. The first part is called as a cell body or cyton. The second part is called as an axon, and it ends into the axon terminal. After that, we discussed about how an information travels inside the neuron and in between the neurons. And information inside the neuron travels in the form of electrical impulses, whereas in between the neurons, it travels in the form of chemicals, that is in the synapse or the space between the neurons. After discussing the structure of the neuron and how an impulse or information is traveling from neuron to neuron, then we discuss about the reflex action. Reflex action is a spontaneous action in which the body does not wait for the brain to respond. The information is sent to the brain, but the action is performed by the spinal cord itself, which involves the sensory neurons, the relay neurons, the motor neurons, and the spinal cord. And the pathway of the reflex action is called as the reflex arc. Now let us discuss questions from the previous years related to these topics. This question was asked in 2018 for 2 marks. This question was divided into 2 parts. The first part asked us to name one gustatory receptor and one olfactory receptor. The gustatory receptor is present in our tongue. An example for olfactory receptor is our nose. Gustatory receptor is responsible for sensing the taste, whereas the olfactory receptor is responsible for sensing the smell. Coming to the second part of the question, they asked us to fill in what is A and B in the flowchart, and this flowchart represents the electrical impulse which travels in the neuron. They have given dendrite, then A, B, and endpoint of neuron. So we know from the dendrite, the information goes to the cyton or the cell body, that is A. After the cell body, that is the second part, that is B, it goes on to the axon. Then from axon, it goes to the end point of neuron called as the axon terminal, which is nothing but the branching of the axon. So the information is passed from dendrite, cyton, axon, and then to the end point of the neuron. With this, we come to the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching the video. If you like this video, do not forget to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and please subscribe to our YouTube channel.